The wind howled like a pack of wolves, clawing at the tattered sails of the St. Peter, as it lurched through the icy swells of the North Pacific. It was November 1741, and the Russian expedition, led by the indomitable Captain Vitus Bering, had been battered by storms for weeks. The crew, gaunt and shivering, clung to their posts, their faces etched with desperation. Supplies had dwindled to scraps of moldy bread and brackish water. The promise of glory in charting the unclaimed edges of the world had long since faded, replaced by a primal urge to survive. On the deck, Georg Wilhelm Steller, the expedition's naturalist, stood apart, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the jagged peaks of an unknown island pierced the fog. Steller was not like the others, where the sailors saw only hardship. He saw wonder, a man of science. He carried a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with sketches of seabirds, fish, and strange algae that glowed under moonlight. His hands, roughened by cold, clutched the railing as the ship groaned against a hidden reef. The crew cursed, their voices swallowed by the gale, but Steller's heart raced with a different kind of fire. This desolate place, this forgotten speck in the vast Pacific, held secrets no European had ever touched, and then he saw it. A shadow moved beneath the waves, vast and deliberate, parting the kelp forests like a god stirring the deep. It was no whale, no seal. Its form was too ponderous, too serene. Steller leaned forward, his breath catching as the creature broke the surface. Its massive head, blunt and whiskered, glistened in the weak sunlight. Its body, nearly 30 feet long, rolled gently, revealing a hide thick as armor, pitted with scars from a life spent grazing the ocean's meadows. The crew fell silent, their curses replaced by gasps. "What in God's name is that?" muttered Ivan, the grizzled first mate, his hand tightening on his harpoon. Steller's mind raced. He had read of manatees in the tropics, sluggish beasts of warm rivers, but this was something else entirely, a leviathan of the cold seas, a relic from a time when giants ruled the earth. He scrambled for his journal, his fingers numb as he sketched the creature's outline, noting its small, soulful eyes and the way it nibbled kelp with a bovine calm. "Hydrodamalis," he whispered, naming it after the sea and its grazing nature. Boy Bayan Steller. The words felt sacred, as if he were christening a forgotten deity. But even as he marveled, a chill settled in his chest. The crew's eyes gleamed with a different hunger, not for knowledge, but for survival. The St. Peter was stranded, its hull breached, and the men were starving. Steller overheard their murmurs. The creature's meat could feed them for weeks, its fat could fuel their lamps, its hide could patch their boats. He turned to Captain Bering, a stern Dane whose face was carved with the weight of command. "We must study it first," Steller pleaded, his voice barely audible over the wind. "This is a discovery for the ages." Bering's eyes narrowed. "Discovery won't fill Belly's hair, Steller. If it moves, it's meat." The crew cheered, their desperation drowning out Steller's protests. He watched, helpless, as they readied their boats, harpoons glinting like wolves' teeth. The sea cow, oblivious, floated closer, its massive form bobbing in the shallows. It trusted the world, Steller realized, in a way no creature should. That night, as the crew slept in their damp berths, Steller sat by a flickering lantern, his journal open. The ship creaked, and the wind carried strange moans from the silo, mournful, like a dirge for something ancient. He wrote feverishly, describing the sea cow's gentle movements, its lack of fear, its sheer enormity. But his pen hesitated as he imagined the slaughter to come. He had seen what men did to the unknown. They claimed it, carved it, consumed it. The sea cow, he feared, would not survive the greed of empires. In the distance, the island loomed, its cliffs shrouded in mist. The native Aleut people, who called this place home, watched from the shadows. They knew the sea cows as Qanax, guardians of the ocean's balance. Their elders whispered of a time when the seas teemed with these giants, their grazing keeping the kelp forests alive, their presence a covenant with the deep. But the Aleut saw the newcomers' ships, their sharp blades, their hungry eyes. A young hunter named Kael, barely 16, crouched behind a boulder, his heart pounding. He had never seen men like these, pale as ghosts, their voices harsh and foreign. His grandmother's stories echoed in his mind. When the balance is broken, the sea will rise. Kael slipped through the darkness, his feet silent on the rocky shore. He reached the water's edge, where a lone sea cow grazed, its silhouette a mountain against the moonlit waves. He knelt, his hand brushing the cold sea, and whispered a prayer to the Qanax. "Protect us," he said, "from what comes." The sea cow turned its head, its eyes meeting his, and for a moment, Kael felt the weight of centuries, an understanding older than words. Then, a shout from the Russian camp shattered the silence. Lanterns flared, and the hunt began. Steller, still awake, heard the commotion. He rushed to the deck, his journal clutched to his chest. The crew was already in the water, their boats slicing through the waves. Harpoons flew, and a scream not human, but primal tore through the night. The first sea cow thrashed, its blood darkening the water. Steller's knees buckled. He had brought these men here, his curiosity guiding their path. Now he wondered if he had doomed a species. As dawn broke, the crew hauled their prize ashore. A single sea cow, its body dwarfing the men who surrounded it. They laughed, carving slabs of meat, their faces smeared with grease. Steller stood apart, his hands trembling as he sketched the corpse. The Aleuts watched from the cliffs, their eyes burning with quiet rage. Kael, hidden among them, gripped his spear. The sea, he knew, was watching too, and it would not forgive. The St. Peter remained stranded, its fate tied to the island and its secrets. Steller, torn between science and guilt, vowed to protect the sea cows, to ensure their story outlived their slaughter. But the winds carried a warning, and the waves whispered of a reckoning. The forgotten giants had been found, and their time was running out. The moon hung low over the Commander Islands, its pale light casting shadows that danced across the jagged cliffs. Kael, a wiry Aleut boy of 16, crouched in the tall grasses near the shore, his breath shallow to avoid detection. His dark eyes, sharp as a gull's, followed the flickering lanterns of the Russian camp. The foreigners' voices carried on the wind-harsh, guttural, unlike the rhythmic cadence of his people's tongue. They laughed as they carved the remains of the sea cow they'd slaughtered that morning, its massive carcass now a grotesque heap of flesh and bone. Kael's stomach churned, not from hunger but from dread. The Qanax, the sea's guardian, had been desecrated. Kael's grandmother, Annika, had raised him on stories of the Qanax. In the long winters, when the fires burned low in their soud-roofed barabara, she'd spoken of the great sea cows that kept the ocean alive. They grazed the kelp forests, she'd said, her voice soft as seal fur, and the kelp feeds the fish, the seals, the whales. Without the Qanax, the sea forgets its rhythm. As a child, Kael had imagined them as gentle giants, their massive forms gliding through the deep, their small eyes holding the wisdom of the tides. But now, seeing the foreigner's blades tear through one, he felt a wound in his own chest. He shifted, his fingers brushing the obsidian-tipped spear at his side. The weapon was his father's, passed down after a Russian harpoon claimed his life 2 summers ago. Kael had been too young to fight then, but not now. The Russians had returned, their ship wrecked on the reef, and with them came a hunger that threatened everything his people held sacred. He glanced at the sea, its surface rippling under the moon. Somewhere out there, the Qanax still grazed, unaware of the danger creeping closer. A rustle in the grass snapped Kael's attention. It was Tala, his cousin, her face smudged with ash to blend with the night. "They're planning another hunt," she whispered, her voice taut. "I heard them talking. They want to fill their ship with Qanax hides before the storms trap them here." Tala was older by a year, her courage matched only by her recklessness. She'd once swum into a riptide to save a stranded seal pup, earning her the nickname Tide Dancer among the elders. Kael's jaw tightened. "They don't understand," he said. "The Qanax aren't just food, they're part of the sea's heart." Tala nodded, her eyes glinting with defiance. "Then we stop them," she said. "Tonight." Kael hesitated. The elders had forbidden open conflict, fearing the Russians' muskets and cannons, but the sight of the sea cow's blood staining the shore burned away his caution. "Meet me at the cove," he said. "We'll warn the herd." Under the cover of darkness, Kael and Tala crept toward the hidden cove where the Qanax often gathered. The path was treacherous, winding through slick rocks and thorny shrubs, but Kael knew it as well as his own heartbeat. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and kelp, and the distant moans of the sea cows echoed like a lullaby from his childhood. As they reached the cove, the sight stole Kael's breath. Dozens of Qanax floated in the shallow waters, their massive bodies swaying with the tide. Their whiskered faces bobbed above the surface, nibbling kelp with a serenity that made Kael's heart ache. They were so trusting, so unafraid. Tala gripped his arm. "Look," she hissed, pointing to the horizon. A Russian longboat, its oars cutting silently through the water, approached the cove. The glint of harpoons caught the moonlight. Kael's pulse quickened. "They've found them," he whispered. He scanned the cove, searching for a way to act. The Qanax were too slow to flee, their bulk making them easy targets. But the Aleuts had one advantage. They knew the sea. Kael waded into the icy water, his skin prickling as the cold bit deep. Tala followed, her breath visible in the chill air. They moved toward the largest sea cow, a matriarch whose hide was scarred from decades of grazing among the reefs. Kael reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her flank. Her skin was rough, warm despite the frigid sea, and her small eye turned to him, calm and knowing. "Go," he whispered, pushing gently, "to the deep waters." The matriarch snorted, a plume of mist rising, and began to move, her bulk nudging the others. Slowly, the herd shifted, gliding toward the open sea. But the longboat was closer now, its crew whispering orders. A harpooner stood at the bow, his weapon poised. Kael's heart pounded. He grabbed a loose kelp stalk and hurled it toward the boat, hoping to distract them. The stalk splashed harmlessly, but it drew a shout from the Russians. "There!" one yelled, pointing toward the shore. Tala pulled Kael behind a rock, her hand clamping over his mouth. The boat veered, its lantern casting a beam across the water. For a moment, Kael thought they'd been seen, but the light passed, and the boat turned back toward the herd. "We can't let them get closer," Tala said, her voice fierce. She pointed to a cluster of jagged rocks jutting from the cove's entrance. "If we block the channel, they can't follow." Kael nodded, his mind racing. The rocks were unstable, a natural barrier that could be toppled with enough force. He and Tala scrambled ashore, their hands scrabbling at the stones. They pushed, their muscles straining, until a boulder shifted, tumbling into the water with a deafening splash. The Russians shouted, their boat rocking as waves surged. Another rock followed, then another, sealing the cove's entrance. The herd, sensing the disturbance, moved faster, their moans rising in a haunting chorus. Kael watched, his chest tight with hope and fear. The longboat circled, its crew cursing as they realized the channel was blocked. But Kael knew this was only a delay. The Russians would return, their hunger insatiable. He turned to Tala, her face flushed with exertion. "We need the elders," he said. "They'll know what to do." As they retreated into the night, a strange sound stopped Kael in his tracks, a low, resonant hum, like the sea itself was singing. He looked back at the cove, where the matriarch's silhouette lingered against the moon. Her eye met his again, and for a moment he felt a connection deeper than words, as if the Qanax were entrusting him with their fate. The hum faded, replaced by the crash of waves, but its echo lingered in his bones. Back at the village, the elders gathered in the barabara, their faces grim. Annika, her white hair braided with shells, listened as Kael and Tala recounted the night's events. "The Qanax have spoken to you," she said, her voice heavy with prophecy. "But the foreigner's greed is a tide we cannot hold back alone." She reached into a sealskin pouch, pulling out a carved bone pendant, shaped like a sea cow. "This is the mark of the Qanax as chosen," she said, placing it around Kael's neck. "You must protect them, or the sea will claim us all." As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of fire, Kael stood on the cliffs, dependent heavy against his chest. Below, the Russian camp stirred, their boats already being repaired. The Qanax was safe for now, but Kael knew the hunt was far from over. The sea whispered its warning, and he felt its weight, a promise, a burden, a call to fight for the giants who could not fight for themselves. The dawn broke over the Commander Islands with a blood-red hue, as if the sea itself mourned the slaughter of the Qanax. Kael stood on the cliffs, the bone pendant around his neck cold against his skin. Below, the Russian camp buzzed with activity. The wrecked St. Peter listed against the reef, its hull splintered, but the crew had not been idle. They'd built a makeshift dock, their longboats bobbing beside it, laden with harpoons and nets. The air reeked of rendered fat, the remnants of the first sea cow now fueling their lanterns and cooking fires. Kael's fists clenched. The Qanax were not mere beasts to his people, they were the keepers of the ocean's balance, their grazing sustaining the kelp forests that fed the fish, the seals, the very lifeblood of the Aleut in the village. The elders' voices rose in heated debate within the barabara. Annika, Kael's grandmother, stood at the center, her weathered hands raised for silence. "The foreigners have tasted the Qanax's flesh," she said, her voice like the crack of ice. They will not stop until the sea is empty. The elders murmured, some advocating peace, others whispering of war. Kael, still an outsider in their council, felt the weight of the pendant. He was no elder, but the Qanax had chosen him, or so Annika claimed. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest. We blocked their path last night, but they'll find another. We must act before they take more. Tala, standing at his side, nodded fiercely. They're weak now, stranded. If we strike their boats, they can't hunt. Her words sparked murmurs of approval, but Annika's eyes darkened. The sea will judge them, she said, but we must not spill blood lightly. The Qanax demands sacrifice, not vengeance. Kael bit back his frustration. Sacrifice was a fine word, but it wouldn't stop the harpoons. Across the island, in the Russian camp, Captain Vitus Bering surveyed his men with a commander's grim resolve. His face, etched with lines from years at sea, betrayed no weakness, though his coughs echoed in the damp air. The crew was restless, their bellies full for the first time in weeks, thanks to the sea cow's meat. But Bering knew the St. Peter would not sail again without repairs, and winter was closing in. The sea cows, massive, docile, abundant, were their salvation. He turned to Ivan, the first mate, whose hands were still slick with blubber. "How many can we take?" Bering asked. Ivan grinned, his teeth stained with tobacco. "Hundreds, Captain. The waters teem with them. Their fat alone could light St. Petersburg for a year." Bering nodded, though his eyes lingered on the horizon. He'd heard the Aleut's whispers, seen their shadows in the fog. They were no strangers to conflict, but these natives were different, silent, watchful, as if the sea itself were their ally. Georg Steller, the expedition's naturalist, stood apart, his journal clutched like a shield. The slaughter of the first sea cow haunted him. He'd begged Bering to spare them, to study their habits, but the captain's pragmatism had won. Now, as the crew prepared for another hunt, Steller felt a growing dread. He approached Bering, his voice low. "These creatures are unique, Captain. If we kill them all, we erase something irreplaceable." Bering's gaze was cold. "Your science won't keep us alive, Herr Steller. Tell me how to fix the ship, or stay out of the way." Steller retreated, his heart heavy. He opened his journal, its pages filled with sketches of the sea cow's gentle eyes, its slow, deliberate movements. He'd named it Hydrodamalis gigas, a monument to its grandeur, but he feared his discovery would be its doom. As he wrote, a shadow fell across the page. Ivan loomed over him, his breath sour. "Keep your drawings, scholar. They'll fetch a fine price in Moscow when we're rich." Steller's stomach twisted. His work, meant to preserve knowledge, was becoming a map to slaughter. Back in the village, Kael and Tala slipped away from the council, their plan forming in whispers. The Russians' longboats were their lifeline. Without them, the hunt would stall. Kael led Tala to a hidden vantage point above the dock, where the boats were tied. The tide was low, exposing the jagged rocks beneath. "We can't destroy them outright," Kael said, "or they'll turn their muskets on us. But we can make it harder." Tala's eyes gleamed. "We'll cut the ropes, let the tide take them." Under the cover of fog, they crept down the cliffs, their movements silent as seals. The dock was unguarded, the Russians too busy feasting on sea cow meat. Kael's knife, honed from volcanic glass, sliced through the ropes with ease. One by one, the boats drifted free, caught by the current, and carried toward the reef. Tala stifled a laugh as the first boat scraped against the rocks, its hull splintering, but their triumph was short-lived. A shout rang out from the camp, and lanterns flared. "Saboteurs!" Ivan's voice boomed, followed by the clatter of muskets being loaded. Kael grabbed Tala's arm, pulling her into the shadows. They scrambled up the cliff, their breaths ragged. Behind them, the Russians swarmed the dock, cursing as they saw their boats adrift. Kael's heart pounded, but a flicker of hope sparked. The Qanax would have another night, maybe two. As they reached the village, Annika met them, her face unreadable. "You've stirred the beast," she said, "but it will not sleep long." That night, Kael couldn't rest. He slipped out of the barabara and returned to the cove, the pendant heavy against his chest. The sea was calm, the Qanax grazing in the moonlight. Their moans filled the air, a haunting melody that seemed to carry a warning. Kael knelt by the water, his hand trailing in the cold surf. The matriarch sea cow, the one he'd touched the night before, surfaced nearby. Her eye met his, and for a moment he felt the sea's pulse, nascent, unyielding, angry. Back at the Russian camp, Bering stood by the fire, his cough worsening. Ivan approached, his face grim. "The natives did this, Captain. They're protecting those beasts." Bering's eyes narrowed. "Then we teach them a lesson. Tomorrow, we hunt natives, or see cows, it matters not. We will not starve." Steller, overhearing, felt a chill. The hunger of empires was a force no science could stop, and the Qanax were caught in its jaws. As the stars faded, Kael stood on the cliffs, watching the Russian camp. The sea whispered below, its voice growing louder, angrier. The Qanax were more than creatures, they were a covenant, a promise between his people and the ocean. And Kael, chosen or not, would fight to keep that promise, even if it meant facing the full might of the foreigner's greed. The fog clung to the Commander Islands like a shroud, muffling the world in a damp, grey silence. Georg Steller sat hunched in the dim glow of a whale-oil lantern, his journal open on a crate that served as his desk. The St. Peter's hold, where he'd taken refuge, reeked of salt and rot, the ship's timbers groaning as if mourning its own ruin. His hands trembled as he sketched the sea cow Hydrodamalis gigas, its massive form filling the page with hurried lines. The creature's small, soulful eyes stared back from the paper, accusing, pleading. Steller's pen hesitated, ink blotting the page. He had named this leviathan, brought it into the light of science, but now he feared he'd handed it to the jaws of destruction. Outside, the Russian camp buzzed with predatory energy. The crew, emboldened by their first kill, prepared for another hunt. The sea cow's meat had staved off starvation, its fat fueling their fires, its hide patching their boats. Captain Vitus Bering, coughing into a blood-stained cloth, had declared the creatures their salvation, but Steller saw no salvation, only slaughter. Each harpoon strike was a wound to his soul, a betrayal of the wonder that had driven him to these frozen shores. He closed his journal, the weight of his discovery pressing against his chest like a stone. The night before, he'd overheard Ivan, the first mate, boasting of the riches the sea cows would bring. "Their hides will line our pockets," Ivan had said, his voice thick with greed. "Moscow will pay dearly for such beasts." Steller's protests had been met with scorn. "Your drawings won't feed us," Ivan had spat, snatching a page from Steller's journal to prove his point. The page, a detailed sketch of the sea cow's anatomy, had been passed among the crew, fueling their hunger. Steller's heart sank. His work, meant to preserve knowledge, was becoming a blueprint for extinction. A sudden thud against the ship's hull jolted Steller from his thoughts. He stumbled to the deck, where the fog was so thick he could barely see the shore. Shadows moved in the mist, Aleut figures, silent and swift, slipping past the Russian sentries. Steller's pulse quickened. The natives had sabotaged the longboats the previous night, a desperate act to protect the sea cows. He admired their courage, but he feared the consequences. Bering's patience was thin, and his men were armed with muskets, and a growing sense of entitlement. Steller crept toward the camp, his boots sinking into the muddy shore. The air was heavy with the scent of blood and burning fat. In the center of the camp, a fire roared, casting grotesque shadows on the faces of the crew. Ivan stood over a pile of sea cow bones, barking orders to repair the damaged boats. "We'll hunt at dawn," he declared. "The natives think they can stop us, but we'll show them who rules these waters." The men cheered, their voices a hungry chorus. Steller's stomach twisted. He had to act, but how? His words held no sway with Bering, and the crew saw him as a weak scholar, not a man of action. As he turned back toward the ship, a glint in the fog caught his eye. A figure stood at the edge of the camp, cloaked in sealskin, watching him. It was an Aleut woman, her face framed by white braids adorned with shells. Steller recognized her authority. The natives deferred to her, their eyes lowered in respect. She beckoned him with a subtle nod, then vanished into the mist. Against his better judgment, Steller followed, his heart pounding. The path led to a hidden cave, its entrance concealed by tangled kelp. Inside, the air was damp, the walls etched with carvings of sea cows and waves. The woman, Annika, stood by a small fire, her gaze piercing. "You are the one who names the Qanax," she said, her voice low but commanding. Steller nodded, unsure whether to feel honored or accused. "I am Georg Steller, naturalist. I study the creatures of this world to understand them." Annika's eyes narrowed. "You study to claim people bring death." Her words cut deeper than any harpoon. Steller opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand. "The Qanax are the sea's heart. If they die, the ocean will turn against us all. She gestured to the carvings, their lines glowing faintly in the firelight. Long ago, my people made a pact with the Qanax. We take only what we need, and they keep the kelp alive. Your people take everything. Steller's mind raced. He thought of his sketches, his notes, his dream of presenting the sea cow to the scientific societies of Europe. But what was the cost? I want to protect them, he said, his voice cracking. But my crew, they won't listen. Annika studied him, her expression unreadable. Then you must choose, she said. Your people or the Qanax. She handed him a small bone pendant, carved in the shape of a sea cow. This marks you as one who sees. Keep it hidden, or your own will turn against you. Steller took the pendant, its weight both a promise and a burden. As he slipped it beneath his coat, a distant shout echoed from the camp. Annika vanished into the shadows, leaving Steller alone with the carvings and his guilt. Back at the camp, chaos had erupted. Ivan stood over a crumpled figure, Russian sailor, his face bloodied. Thieves, Ivan roared. The natives stole my journal. Steller's blood ran cold. The journal wasn't Ivan's, it was his own, left unguarded in his haste to follow Annika. He pushed through the crowd, his voice hoarse. It's mine, my notes, my sketches. Ivan's eyes glinted with malice. Yours, eh? Then why was it found in a native's hands? He held up the journal, its pages torn and smeared with mud. Steller lunged for it, but Ivan pulled it away, tossing it to another sailor. This'll guide us to every herd in these waters, Ivan said, grinning. You've done us a service, scholar. Steller's vision blurred with rage and despair. His work, his legacy, was now a weapon. He thought of Annika's words. You must choose. But the choice felt impossible. If he defied Bering and Ivan, he'd be branded a traitor, left to die on this forsaken island. If he did nothing, the sea cows would vanish, their gentle moans silenced forever. He stumbled back to the ship, the pendant burning against his chest. In the hold, he opened a fresh page in a hidden notebook, writing feverishly. Hydrodamalis gigas, he scrawled, a creature of peace, doomed by man's greed. I must find a way to save them, or my soul will bear the stain of their end. Outside, the fog thickened, and the sea began to stir. A low hum rose from the deep, like the Qanax mourning their own fate. Steller clutched the pendant, his resolve hardening. He would protect the sea cows, even if it meant betraying his own. But as the first light of dawn broke through the mist, the sound of sharpening harpoons filled the air, and Steller knew time was running out. The night was black as obsidian, the only light coming from the faint glow of the aurora twisting across the sky. Kael crouched among the rocks of the hidden cove, his breath shallow, the bone pendant around his neck pulsing with a strange warmth. The air was thick with the scent of kelp and salt, and the low moans of the Qanax, the sea cows echoed from the water below. Their massive forms bobbed in the shallows, grazing peacefully, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Kael's heart pounded, not from fear but from a fire that had been kindled the moment he saw the first sea cow's blood stain the sea red. Tonight, he would act. Tala, his cousin, knelt beside him, her eyes glinting with the same defiance that had earned her the name Tidun. Behind them, a small band of Aleut rebel 6 young hunters, their faces painted with ash waited in silence. They were the outcasts of the village, too restless for the elders' cautious ways, too angry to stand by as the Russians slaughtered the Qanax. Kael had rallied them after the council's refusal to fight, his words fueled by the pendant's weight and Annika's prophecy. The Qanax have chosen you. Now, as the Russian longboats prepared for a midnight hunt, Kael's plan was simple but perilous. Sabotage the boats, disrupt the hunt, and buy time for the sea cows to flee to deeper waters. The cove was their sanctuary, its narrow entrance guarded by jagged rocks, but the Russians, undeterred by the previous night's sabotage, had repaired their boats and found a new path through the reefs. Kael had overheard their plans in the fog, Ivan's voice boasting of a harvest that would fill their ship's hold. The thought of more Qanax carcasses piled on the shore made Kael's stomach churn. He tightened his grip on his father's obsidian-tipped spear, its weight a reminder of the blood already spilled by Russian harpoons. Tala nudged him, pointing to the water. A longboat glided silently through the mist, its oars muffled by rags. 5 Russians manned it, their faces shadowed, but their harpoons glinting in the aurora's light. At the bow stood Ivan, his bulk unmistakable, his eyes scanning the cove. Kael's breath caught. The Qanax were too close, their massive bodies clustered near the surface, easy targets. "Now," Kael whispered, signaling the rebels. They moved like shadows, slipping down the cliffs to the water's edge. Kael and Tala took the lead, wading into the icy sea, their bodies numb but their resolve unyielding. The plan was to drive the sea cows away before the Russians could strike. Kael approached the matriarch, the scarred female whose eyes had met his nights before. He touched her flank, whispering, "Go, to the deep." She snorted, a plume of mist rising, and began to move, nudging the others. The herd stirred, their moans rising in a mournful chorus, but the Russians were faster than Kael had expected. A harpoon flew, its barbed tip slicing through the water and striking a young sea cow. The creature thrashed, its cry piercing the night, a sound that clawed at Kael's soul. Blood bloomed in the kelp, dark and spreading. The herd panicked, their massive bodies colliding as they tried to flee the shallow cove. Kael dove into the water, his spear forgotten, his only thought to save the calf. He swam toward it, the cold burning his lungs, and grabbed the harpoon shaft, trying to pull it free. The calf's eyes, wide with pain, locked onto his. Tala shouted from the shore, her voice drowned by the Russians' yells. Another harpoon flew, narrowly missing Kael. He yanked at the barbed tip, but it was lodged deep, the calf's blood clouding the water around him. The Russian's boat was closing in, Ivan's laughter cutting through the chaos. "Got a native with the beast," he roared. Kael's vision blurred with rage and despair. He couldn't save the calf not now, but he could still fight. He swam back to the shore, where Tala and the rebels were hurling rocks at the longboat. The missiles splashed harmlessly, but they drew the Russians' attention. Ivan raised a musket, its barrel glinting. "Enough," he bellowed, firing into the air. The shot echoed, scattering seabirds and freezing the rebels in place. Kael pulled Tala behind a boulder, his heart racing. The Russians were too many, too armed, but the Qanax was still moving, the matriarch leading them toward the cove's mouth. Kael's eyes darted to the cliffs above, where a pile of loose rocks teetered. "The barrier," he whispered to Tala. "If we bring it down, they can't follow." She nodded, her face set with determination. They scrambled up the cliff, their hands bloody from the sharp stones. The other rebels joined them, pushing against the boulders with all their strength. The rocks groaned, then gave way, tumbling into the water with a thunderous crash. The longboat rocked violently, Ivan cursing as he struggled to keep it upright. The channel was blocked, the sea cow slipping into the deeper waters beyond, but the victory was fleeting. Another longboat appeared, its crew alerted by the musket shot. Kael's rebels scattered, melting into the fog, but he and Tala were too exposed. Ivan's boat reached the shore, and he leaped out, his musket trained on Kael. "You little rats," he snarled. "Think you can stop us?" Kael stood his ground, his spear raised, but Tala pulled him back. "Not like this," she hissed. They fled, dodging through the rocks as musket balls whizzed past. They reached the village at dawn, their clothes torn and their bodies bruised. Annika was waiting, her eyes dark with knowing. "You've drawn blood," she said, her voice heavy. "Not just the Qanax', but ours." She gestured to the horizon, where the Russian camp was stirring, their anger a palpable force. Kael touched the pendant, its warmth gone. "We saved some," he said, his voice hoarse. But the calf, he couldn't finish. The memory of its eyes haunted him. Annika placed a hand on his shoulder. "The sea sees your fight," she said, "but the Qanax are few, and the foreigner's hunger is endless. You must find another way, or we will all pay the price." Kael nodded, his resolve hardening. The cove was safe for now, but the Russians would return, and the Qanax could not run forever. As the sun rose, painting the sea in hues of fire, Kael felt the weight of his choice. He was the chosen, and he would fight, though he feared the blood in the kelp was only the beginning. The fog rolled in thicker than ever, cloaking the Commander Islands in a veil that seemed to pulse with secrets. Kael stood at the edge of the village, his eyes scanning the mist-shrouded cliffs. The bone pendant around his neck felt heavier, its carved Qanax shape a constant reminder of his vow to protect the sea cows. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and blood, the memory of the calf's dying cry still echoing in his ears. The Russians had been stalled by the collapsed rocks in the cove, but Kael knew their hunger would not be denied for long. The Qanax were running out of time, and so were his people. In the Barabara, the elders' voices were a storm of fear and division. Annika, her white braids glinting in the firelight, spoke of omens, seabirds falling silent, waves crashing without wind. "The sea is angry," she warned, her gaze fixed on Kael. "The Qanax's blood calls for justice." The younger hunters, emboldened by Kael and Tala's raid, clamored for war, their spears sharpened and ready. But the elders urged caution, fearing the Russians' muskets and the wrath of their distant empire. Kael stood silent, his heart torn. He wanted to fight, to drive the foreigners away, but Annika's words lingered. Sacrifice, not vengeance. As the council argued, a strange hush fell over the village. A low hum, like the Qanax's moans but deeper, reverberated through the ground. Kael slipped outside, drawn to the cliffs. The fog parted briefly, revealing a figure standing on the rocky outcrop, a cloaked silhouette, motionless, facing the sea. The villagers whispered of the Mistwalker, a guardian spirit or outcast shaman, seen only when the ocean's balance was threatened. Kael's pulse quickened. He'd heard the stories as a child. The Mistwalker appeared before great calamities, guiding the Aleut or cursing those who defied the sea. Was this figure here to help or to judge? Kael approached cautiously, his spear in hand. The figure turned, its face hidden beneath a hood of sealskin. "You wear the Qanax's mark," a voice rasped, neither male nor female, as if born from the waves. Kael touched the pendant, his throat dry. "Who are you?" he asked. The Mistwalker stepped closer, and Kael glimpsed eyes that seemed to hold the depth of the ocean itself. "I am what remains when the sea weeps," they said. "The Qanax are fading, and with them, your people's covenant. Act, or all will be lost." Before Kael could respond, a scream tore through the fog. Tala sprinted toward him, her face pale. "The Russians there, moving. They've found another cove." Kael's heart sank. The Mistwalker was gone, vanished as if swallowed by the mist. He followed Tala to the village, where the rebels were already gathering their weapons. "They're using your stolen journal," Tala said, her voice tight with anger. The scholar's drawings showed them where the Qanax hide. Kael cursed under his breath. Steller's notes, meant to preserve the sea cows, were now a map to their slaughter. The rebels, led by Kael, moved swiftly through the fog, their footsteps silent on the rocky paths. The new cove was smaller, its waters shallow and teeming with Qanax. The herd grazed unaware, their massive bodies swaying in the current. But the Russians were already there, 3 longboats gliding through the mist, harpoons at the ready. Ivan stood at the bow of the lead boat, his laughter carrying over the water. "We'll feast tonight," he shouted, raising his musket. Kael's blood boiled. He signaled the rebels to spread out their plan to create a distraction and drive the herd to safety. Tala lit a small fire, using dried kelp to send a plume of smoke into the air. The Russians turned, startled, as the rebels hurled rocks from the cliffs. The longboats rocked, but Ivan's voice cut through the chaos. "Fire!" he roared, and musket shots rang out, splintering the rocks above Kael's head. He ducked, his heart pounding, but kept throwing, aiming for the boat's oars. One struck true, snapping an oar and sending a Russian sprawling into the water. The Qanax stirred, their moans rising in panic as they sensed the danger. Kael dove into the sea, the cold biting his skin. He swam toward the matriarch, her scarred flank a beacon in the murky water. "Go," he urged, pushing against her bulk. She moved, slowly at first, leading the herd toward the cove's mouth. But a harpoon flew, striking a young male. The sea cow thrashed, its blood clouding the water, and Kael's vision blurred with rage. He surfaced, gasping, only to see Ivan's boat bearing down on him. "Got you now, native," Ivan snarled, raising his musket. Before the shot could ring out, a strange wave surged through the cove, rocking the boat violently. Ivan stumbled, his musket firing into the air. Kael seized the moment, diving beneath the water and grabbing the harpoon's rope, pulling with all his strength. The barbed tip tore free, but the sea cow was too weak, sinking slowly into the depths. Kael's chest tightened with grief, but he swam on, guiding the matriarch and the remaining herd toward the open sea. On the shore, Tala and the rebels kept up their assault, their rocks forcing the Russians to retreat, but the victory was bittersweet. The Qanax lay dead, their bodies tangled in the kelp. Kael climbed onto the rocks, his body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Tala grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce. "We saved most of them," she said, but her voice wavered. Kael nodded, unable to speak. The Mistwalker's words echoed in his mind. "Act, or all will be lost." That night, as the village huddled in fear of Russian retaliation, Kael returned to the cliffs. The fog was thicker now, the aurora gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The Mistwalker appeared again, their cloak blending with the mist. "You fought well," they said, "but the sea's patience wanes. The Qanax are fewer each day, and the foreigner's greed grows." Kael's voice was hoarse. "What more can I do?" The Mistwalker pointed to the sea, where a faint glow pulsed beneath the waves. "Listen to the Qanax, they will guide you." As the figure vanished, a low hum rose from the deep, stronger now, almost a roar. Kael felt the pendant burn against his chest, and for the first time, he sensed the sea's true power, not just its beauty, but its wrath. The Russians would return, their muskets loaded, their boats repaired, but Kael was ready. The Qanax had chosen him, and the Mistwalker had shown him the path. The fight was far from over, and the sea was watching. The wind howled across the Commander Islands, carrying with it a chill that seemed to rise from the depths of the sea itself. Georg Steller sat in the hold of the wrecked St. Peter, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the damp timbers. His hands, stained with ink and salt, trembled as he clutched the bone pendant Annika had given him, its carved Qanax shape a silent accusation. The journal he'd lost to Ivan was now in the hands of the Russians, its pages guiding their harpoons to the sea cow's hidden coves. Steller's dream of preserving the Hydrodamalis gigas for science had twisted into a nightmare, each slaughter a wound to his soul. He was a man of reason, but reason had failed him. Now, he sought something older, something deeper. The moans of the Qanax haunted his dreams, their gentle eyes pleading for salvation. Steller had tried to reason with Captain Bering, but the captain's coughs grew worse, his patience thinner. "We survive, or we die," Bering had snapped, his eyes cold as the sea. Ivan, the first mate, was worse a predator in human form, his greed fueling the crew's bloodlust. Steller knew he could no longer stand by, a passive observer sketching the end of a species. Annika's words echoed in his mind. "You must choose." The pendant burned against his chest, urging him to act. Under the cover of night, Steller slipped from the ship, his boots crunching on the rocky shore. The fog was a living thing, curling around him like a shroud. He followed the path to the hidden cave where Annika had first confronted him, its entrance concealed by kelp and shadow. The air inside was thick with the scent of earth and sea, the walls glowing faintly with carvings of Qanax and swirling waves. Annika stood by a small fire, but she was not alone. A figure cloaked in sealskin, their face hidden, stood beside her, the Mistwalker. Steller's breath caught. The figure's presence seemed to hum with the same resonance as the sea cow's moans, as if they were an extension of the ocean itself. "You come seeking the Qanax's salvation," Annika said, her voice steady but heavy with judgment. "But salvation demands sacrifice." Steller nodded, his throat tight. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "My people are wrong. I see that now." The Mistwalker stepped forward, their eyes glinting like polished obsidian. "The sea does not trust words," they rasped. "It demands blood, or it will take all." Steller shivered, the weight of their gaze pressing against him. "What must I do?" he asked. Annika gestured to the fire, where a bowl of dark liquid sat, its surface shimmering with an unnatural glow. "A pact," she said. "You bind yourself to the Qanax, to the sea. But know this, your people will see you as a traitor." Steller's mind raced. Betraying the Russians meant abandoning his career, his country, perhaps his life. But the image of the sea cow's blood and the kelp, the sound of their dying cries, was unbearable. He nodded, his voice firm. "I choose the Qanax." The Mistwalker raised a bone dagger, its blade etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight. They pricked Steller's finger, letting a drop of blood fall into the bowl. Annika chanted, her voice low and rhythmic, the words ancient and unfamiliar. The air grew heavy, the cave's walls pulsing with the hum of the sea. Steller felt a jolt, as if the ocean itself flowed through him, cold and unyielding. The Mistwalker spoke, their voice a whisper of waves. "The sea accepts your pledge, but it warns of a reckoning. A surge comes, born of the Qanax's pain. Protect them, or it will swallow all." As the ritual ended, a tremor shook the cave, the ground quaking beneath Steller's feet. He stumbled outside, the fog parting to reveal a sky streaked with unnatural colors, green, violet, crimson. The sea was restless, its waves crashing higher, foam flecked with a strange luminescence. Steller's heart pounded. The Mistwalker's prophecy felt real, tangible, as if the ocean were coiling to strike. He clutched the pendant, its warmth a reminder of his vow. Back at the Russian camp, the crew was in chaos. Ivan had rallied them for another hunt, their repaired longboats ready to launch at dawn. Steller overheard their plans, his stolen journal now a prized possession among the officers. The scholars' maps show every cove, Ivan boasted, waving a torn page. We'll take a dozen Qanax by noon. Steller's blood ran cold. He had to act, but openly defying Ivan would mean death. He slipped back to the ship, his mind racing for a plan. Meanwhile, in the Aleut village, Kael gathered his rebels, their faces grim after the loss of 2 Qanax. Tala, her arm bandaged from a musket graze, argued for a bolder strike. We hit their camp, she said, her eyes fierce. Burn their boats, their supplies. Kael hesitated, Annika's warnings echoing in his mind, but the pendant around his neck pulsed, urging him forward. We can't fight them head-on, he said, but we can make them fear the sea. As night deepened, Steller made his move. He crept to the dock, where the longboats were tied, and loosened their ropes, letting the tide pull them toward the reefs. It was a small act, but it would delay the hunt. As he worked, a shadow moved in the fog. Kael, watching from the cliffs. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Steller was no longer just a Russian. He was an ally, bound by the same vow. But the sea was stirring, its hum growing into a roar. At the village, Annika stood on the shore, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The surge comes, she whispered, as the first tremors shook the island. Kael felt it too, the pendant burning against his chest. The Qanax moaned in the distance, their voices a warning. Steller, returning to the cave, saw the carvings glow brighter, the sea's wrath etched in stone. The pact was sealed, but the cost was coming, and no one Russian, Aleut, or Qanax would escape unscathed. The sea was a restless beast, its waves crashing against the cliffs of the Commander Islands with a fury that seemed to echo the Qanax's fading moans. Kael stood on a hidden ledge overlooking a secluded cove, his heart heavy with the weight of the bone pendant around his neck. Below, a small herd of sea cows grazed in the shallow waters, their massive forms swaying gently among the kelp forests. The cove was a secret, its entrance guarded by jagged cliffs and treacherous currents, known only to the Aleut elders. Kael had found it by chance, guided by the Mistwalker's cryptic words. Listen to the Qanax, they will guide you. This was their last sanctuary, a fragile refuge from the Russians' harpoons. The air was thick with salt and the faint hum of the sea cows, a sound that felt like a heartbeat of the ocean itself. Kael's rebel 6 young hunters, their faces hardened by loss, crouched beside him, their spears and slings at the ready. Tala, her arm still bandaged from the last skirmish, scanned the horizon. They're coming, she whispered, her voice taut. I saw their boats at dawn, following the scholars' maps. Kael's jaw tightened. Steller's stolen journal, with its detailed sketches of coves and Qanax habits, had become the Russians' greatest weapon. The thought of the gentle giants falling to Ivan's greed made Kael's blood burn. He turned to his rebels, his voice low but firm. This cove is their last chance. If the Russians find it, the Qanax are finished. The hunters nodded, their eyes fierce with resolve. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but the sea was their ally. And the cove's natural defenses, its narrow entrance and hidden reefs, gave them a chance. Kael's plan was desperate. Block the entrance with debris, distract the Russians with a decoy, and drive the herd to deeper waters. But the Qanax were slow, trusting, and the Russians were relentless. As the fog thickened, Kael led his rebels down the cliffs, their movements silent as seals. They gathered driftwood and loose rocks, piling them at the cove's mouth to create a barrier. The work was grueling, the cold biting their hands until they bled, but Kael pushed them on, the pendant pulsing against his chest. Below, the Qanax grazed, oblivious to the danger. The matriarch, her scarred flank a map of survival, turned her head toward Kael, her eyes holding a quiet wisdom. He whispered a prayer, his voice lost in the wind. Stay safe, he said, though he knew the sea might demand more than prayers. On the St. Peter Georg, Steller sat in the hold, his heart torn. The pendant Annika had given him was hidden beneath his coat, a secret that marked him as a traitor to his own people. He'd loosened the Russians' boats the previous night, a small act of sabotage, but it hadn't been enough. Ivan had recovered the journal, its pages now guiding the crew to every Qanax hideout. Steller's sketches, meant to preserve the sea cows for science, were now their death warrant. He clutched a new notebook, its pages filled with frantic notes. Hydrodamalis gigas, a creature of peace, doomed by man's greed. He vowed to protect them, but the cost was becoming clear. A shout from the deck snapped Steller from his thoughts. He climbed to the rail, where Ivan stood with Captain Bering, pointing to a map torn from Steller's journal. "This cove," Ivan said, his voice thick with triumph. "The natives can't hide them forever." Bering, his face pale from illness, nodded. "Take 3 boats. Bring back enough to fill the hold." Steller's stomach churned. He stepped forward, his voice shaking. "You're killing them all, Captain. There won't be any left." Ivan laughed, shoving him aside. "Stay out of this, scholar, or you'll be next." Steller retreated, his mind racing. He had to warn the Aleuts to stop the hunt. As the Russians launched their boats, he slipped ashore, following the path to the village. The fog hid him, but the sea's hum grew louder, a warning of the coming storm. He found Annika at the cliff's edge, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "They've found the last cove," she said, her voice heavy. "Your words betray the Steller flinched, the pendant burning against his chest. "I'll stop them," he said. "I swear it." Annika's gaze softened, but only slightly. "The sea is watching, scholar. Prove your vow." She pointed to the cove, where Kael's rebels were still working. Steller ran, his boots slipping on the rocks. He reached the cove as the first Russian boat appeared, its oars cutting through the mist. Kael spotted him, his spear raised, but recognition flashed in his eyes. "You," Kael said, his voice hard. "Your journal brought them here." Steller shook his head, breathless. "I'm with you now. Let me help." Kael hesitated, then nodded. "We need a distraction. Can you draw them away?" Steller agreed, his mind racing. He climbed to a high ledge, waving a torn sail to catch the Russians' attention. "Over here," he shouted, his voice echoing. The boats veered, Ivan cursing as he spotted the figure. "It's the scholar," he roared. "He's with the natives." The distraction worked. Kael's rebels pushed the last rocks into place, sealing the cove's entrance. But the Qanax was still too close. Kael dove into the water, swimming to the matriarch. "Go," he urged, pushing her toward the deep. The herd moved, but slowly, their bulk making them easy targets. A harpoon flew, striking the water inches from Kael. He ducked, his heart pounding, and kept pushing, the pendant glowing faintly. The Russians' boats battered the debris barrier, their shouts growing desperate. Steller, on the ledge, kept waving, drawing their fire. A musket ball grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve, but he held his ground. Tala led the rebels in a final assault, hurling rocks from the cliffs. One struck a Russian, knocking him into the sea. The boats rocked, but Ivan was relentless, his harpoon poised. "We'll have them all," he bellowed. Kael, in the water, felt the sea surge, a strange current pulling at him. The Mistwalker's prophecy echoed. A surge comes, born of the Qanax Espain. The waves grew higher, foam glowing with an eerie light. The matriarch turned, her eyes meeting Kael's, and for a moment he felt her strength, her will to survive. The herd reached the deep water, disappearing into the mist. Kael climbed ashore, exhausted but alive. Steller joined him, his arm bleeding but his resolve unbroken. The Russians retreated, their boats damaged, but Kael knew it wasn't over. Ivan's laughter carried over the water, a promise of return. The sea hummed, its wrath building, and Kael felt the pendant pulse. The Qanax were safe for now, but the last sanctuary was no longer secret, and the storm was coming. The sky over the Commander Islands was a bruise, heavy with clouds that seemed to boil with unnatural fury. It was 1768, 27 years since Georg Steller first glimpsed the Qanax, the sea cows gliding through the kelp forests. Kael, now a man of 43, stood on the same cliffs where he'd once vowed to protect them as a boy. His face was weathered, etched with lines of loss and defiance. The bone pendant around his neck worn smooth by time. The Qanax were nearly gone, their once vast herds reduced to a single survivor, a lone female sighted in the hidden cove. The Russians had not relented, their ships returning year after year, their harpoons relentless. Steller's stolen journal, its pages copied and spread across empires, had guided hunters to every refuge. Kael's heart ached with the weight of failure, but the pendant pulsed, urging him to fight one last time. The village was a shadow of its former self. Many Aleut had fled or fallen to disease and violence, their barabaras crumbling under the weight of Russian dominion. Annika was gone, her final words a warning. the sea will claim what man destroys. Kael had clung to her prophecy, hoping the Mistwalker's promised surge would spare the Qanax, but as he watched the horizon, the sea's hum had grown into a roar, a primal force that shook the cliffs beneath his feet. The air was electric, the wind carrying a metallic Thames, as if the ocean itself were ready to rise. In the Russian camp, now a fortified outpost, Evangrea, but no less cruel, prepared for the final hunt. The last Qanax was a prize, its hide and bones a trophy for the Tsar's court. Captain Bering had long since died, his cough claiming him, but Ivan had risen to command, his greed Steller, now a broken man, lived on the fringes of the camp, shunned as a traitor after his sabotage years ago. His arm, scarred from a musket wound, ached as he watched Ivan's men load their boats. He clutched a hidden notebook, its pages filled with pleas for the Qanax's survival, smuggled to Europe but ignored. The pendant Annika gave him was his only solace, a reminder of the pact he'd made with the sea. Kael gathered his remaining rebels, only 3 now, including Tala, whose fire had never faded. They stood in the hidden cove, the last Qanax grazing alone, her massive form a ghost in the mist. Her eyes, once bright with wisdom, were clouded with age, her scarred flank a testament to decades of survival. Kael knelt by the water, his hand brushing her hide. "You're the last," he whispered, his voice breaking. The sea cow snorted, a plume of mist rising, as if forgiving him for all he couldn't do. Tala gripped his shoulder. "They're coming," she said, pointing to the horizon where Russian boats cut through the waves. The rebels moved quickly, piling rocks and driftwood at the cove's entrance, their hands raw from the effort. Kael knew it wouldn't hold. The Russians had cannons now, their firepower unmatched. But he had one last plan, to lead the Qanax to a deep channel beyond the reefs, where no boat could follow. He waded into the water, urging the sea cow to move. She was slow, her strength fading, but she followed. Her moans a faint echo of the herds that once filled these waters. Steller, meanwhile, slipped into the Russian camp, his heart pounding. He had to stop Ivan, even if it cost his life. He found the powder stores, barrels of gunpowder, stacked for the cannons. With trembling hands, he lit a fuse, its spark hissing in the damp air. The explosion would cripple their boats, giving the Qanax a chance. But as he turned to flee, Ivan loomed before him, his musket raised. "Traitor," Ivan snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Steller braced himself, the pendant warm against his chest. "For the Qanax," he whispered, as the shot rang out. The explosion rocked the camp, flames erupting as the powder ignited. Boats splintered, men screamed, and Ivan staggered, his shot grazing Steller's side. Steller fell, blood soaking the ground, but he crawled into the fog, driven by his vow. At the cove, Kael heard the blast, his hope flaring. The Russians were delayed, but not stopped. He pushed the Qanax harder, her bulk barely clearing the reefs. Tala and the rebels hurled rocks from the cliffs, slowing the remaining boats. Then it came, the surge the Mistwalker had foretold. The sea roared, a wall of water rising from the deep, its crest glowing with an eerie light. Kael froze, the pendant burning against his skin. The Qanax turned, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, he saw not fear but acceptance. The wave crashed, swallowing the cove, the boats, the camp. Kael clung to a rock, Tala's hand gripping his, as the sea claimed everything. The Qanax vanished beneath the foam, her final moan a dirge that shook Kael's soul. When the water receded, the cove was silent, the Qanax gone. Kael stumbled to the shore, his body battered, his heart broken. Tala wept beside him, her fire dimmed. Steller, bloodied but alive, emerged from the fog, his eyes hollow. "She's gone," he said, his voice a whisper. "The last of them." Kael nodded, unable to speak. The sea was still, its wrath spent, but its silence was a judgment. The Russians' camp lay in ruins, Ivan's body among the wreckage. The survivors fled, their greed no match for the ocean's revenge. Kael looked to the horizon, where the Mistwalker's shadow lingered, then faded. The pendant was cold now, its power gone. The Qanax were no more, but their memory lived in Kael, in Steller, in the sea itself. As dawn broke, painting the sky in mournful hues, Kael vowed to tell their story, to ensure the world remembered the giants who once ruled the deep. The night was black as obsidian, the only light coming from the faint glow of the aurora twisting across the sky. Kael crouched among the rocks of the hidden cove, his breath shallow, the bone pendant around his neck pulsing with a strange warmth. The air was thick with the scent of kelp and salt, and the low moans of the Qanax, the sea cows, echoed from the water below. Their massive forms bobbed in the shallows, grazing peacefully, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Kael's heart pounded, not from fear but from a fire that had been kindled the moment he saw the first sea cow's blood stain the sea red. Tonight, he would act. Tala, his cousin, knelt beside him, her eyes glinting with the same defiance that had earned her the name Tidun. Behind them, a small band of Aleut rebels, 6 young hunters, their faces painted with ash, waited in silence. They were the outcasts of the village, too restless for the elders' cautious ways, too angry to stand by as the Russians slaughtered the Qanax. Kael had rallied them after the council's refusal to fight, his words fueled by the pendant's weight and Anarcha's prophecy. The Qanax have chosen you. Now, as the Russian longboats prepared for a midnight hunt, Kael's plan was simple but perilous. Sabotage the boats, disrupt the hunt, and buy time for the sea cows to flee to deeper waters. The cove was their sanctuary, its narrow entrance guarded by jagged rocks, but the Russians, undeterred by the previous night's sabotage, had repaired their boats and found a new path through the reefs. Kael had overheard their plans in the fog, Ivan's voice boasting of a harvest that would fill their ship's hold. The thought of more Qanax carcasses piled on the shore made Kael's stomach churn. He tightened his grip on his father's obsidian-tipped spear, its weight a reminder of the blood already spilled by Russian harpoons. Tala nudged him, pointing to the water. A longboat glided silently through the mist, its oars muffled by rags. 5 Russians manned it, their faces shadowed, but their harpoons glinting in the aurora's light. At the bow stood Ivan, his bulk unmistakable, his eyes scanning the cove. Kael's breath caught. The Qanax were too close, their massive bodies clustered near the surface, easy targets. Now, Kael whispered, signaling the rebels. They moved like shadows, slipping down the cliffs to the water's edge. Kael and Tala took the lead, wading into the icy sea, their bodies numb but their resolve unyielding. The plan was to drive the sea cows away before the Russians could strike. Kael approached the matriarch, the scarred female whose eyes had met his nights before. He touched her flank, whispering, "Go, to the deep." She snorted, a plume of mist rising, and began to move, nudging the others. The herd stirred, their moans rising in a mournful chorus, but the Russians were faster than Kael had expected. A harpoon flew, its barbed tip slicing through the water and striking a young sea cow. The creature thrashed, its cry piercing the night, a sound that clawed at Kael's soul. Blood bloomed in the kelp, dark and spreading. The herd panicked, their massive bodies colliding as they tried to flee the shallow cove. Kael dove into the water, his spear forgotten, his only thought to save the calf. He swam toward it, the cold burning his lungs, and grabbed the harpoon shaft, trying to pull it free. The calf's eyes, wide with pain, locked onto his. Tala shouted from the shore, her voice drowned by the Russians' yells. Another harpoon flew, narrowly missing Kael. He yanked at the barbed tip, but it was lodged deep, the calf's blood clouding the water around him. The Russian's boat was closing in, Ivan's laughter cutting through the chaos. "Got a native with the beast," he roared. Kael's vision blurred with rage and despair. He couldn't save the calf not now, but he could still fight. He swam back to the shore, where Tala and the rebels were hurling rocks at the longboat. The missiles splashed harmlessly, but they drew the Russians' attention. Ivan raised a musket, its barrel glinting. "Enough," he bellowed, firing into the air. The shot echoed, scattering seabirds and freezing the rebels in place. Kael pulled Tala behind a boulder, his heart racing. The Russians were too many, too armed, but the Qanax was still moving, the matriarch leading them toward the cove's mouth. Kael's eyes darted to the cliffs above, where a pile of loose rocks teetered. "The barrier," he whispered to Tala. "If we bring it down, they can't follow." She nodded, her face set with determination. They scrambled up the cliff, their hands bloody from the sharp stones. The other rebels joined them, pushing against the boulders with all their strength. The rocks groaned, then gave way, tumbling into the water with a thunderous crash. The longboat rocked violently, Ivan cursing as he struggled to keep it upright. The channel was blocked, the sea cow slipping into the deeper waters beyond, but the victory was fleeting. Another longboat appeared, its crew alerted by the musket shot. Kael's rebels scattered, melting into the fog, but he and Tala were too exposed. Ivan's boat reached the shore, and he leaped out, his musket trained on Kael. "You little rats," he snarled. "Think you can stop us?" Kael stood his ground, his spear raised, but Tala pulled him back. "Not like this," she hissed. They fled, dodging through the rocks as musket balls whizzed past. They reached the village at dawn, their clothes torn and their bodies bruised. Annika was waiting, her eyes dark with knowing. "You've drawn blood," she said, her voice heavy. "Not just the Qanax, but ours." She gestured to the horizon, where the Russian camp was stirring, their anger a palpable force. Kael touched dependent, its warmth gone. "We saved some," he said, his voice hoarse. But the calf, he couldn't finish. The memory of its eyes haunted him. Annika placed a hand on his shoulder. "The sea sees your fight," she said, "but the Qanax are few, and the foreigner's hunger is endless. You must find another way, or we will all pay the price." Kael nodded, his resolve hardening. The cove was safe for now, but the Russians would return, and the Qanax could not run forever. As the sun rose, painting the sea in hues of fire, Kael felt the weight of his choice. He was the chosen, and he would fight, though he feared the blood in the kelp was only the beginning.